Our guest today is Jack, who runs the YouTube channel TheJackmeister Mongol History. And if the name didn't give it away, we're going to talk about Mongol history today. And this is the first episode of the podcast, actually, where we're covering Asian history. And I hope to do more of this in the future. And we are going to specifically focus on one part of Mongol history today, which is the infamous Golden Horde. And you're currently doing our PhD candidate on Mongol history. So how did you end up studying Mongol history?
So I get the question a lot sometimes, how does a Canadian end up interested in Mongol history? Well, when I was quite young, my mother bought me a book series by Connor Golden, which is sort of a historical fiction talking about the rise to power of Chinggis Khan. So that's Genghis Khan, as we normally call him, but properly Mongolian, Chinggis Khan. And it's just fiction. But it was a good story. It was one I quite enjoyed. I'm from a part of Canada, which is geographically quite similar to Mongolia, very flat, cold, lots of horses. I'd never lived in an actual city. So I connected, I think, quite well with the setting of the story, and I really enjoyed it, and I wanted to learn more about this. I think I was waiting for the next book in the series to come out, and I came across Jack Weatherford's Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World, when Weatherford's a great writer. I have some issues with the historical accuracy of the work, but it's a fantastic introduction if you know like nothing about the topic at all. And I read that, and I don't know, I want to say I was maybe 13 years old, and I was just like enamored by it. And it kind of stayed in my mind up until I think my undergraduate program, and I started to look into it more seriously. And now a couple of years later, I'm working on my PhD on the Mongols. For several years now, I've been involved in my own YouTube channel dedicated to the Mongol Empire and other nomadic peoples. I write regularly for the Kings and Generals channel, all their videos on the Mongols and the Timurids. I write for medievalists.net. With Kings and Generals, we did a podcast series for 2 years dedicated just on the Mongol Empire. I wrote all of that. I have several articles published. I've written in some magazines, and as already noted, I've already written my master's degree on the Mongols, a PhD on the way, and presumably much more as well.
Hopefully a few books as well in the future. I'm looking forward to reading those. But I want to begin before we go into the Golden Horde itself. We have to understand how the empire was formed, and I want to take a look at the and I'm going to follow a little bit of Frank McLean's work on Genghis Khan, which was my first introduction to the Mongol Empire. So I want to, and he begins, and I want to begin this as well with the landscape of the Mongol, because I feel like it's kind of essential as well. Like you said, it's kind of essential in understanding how the Mongols worked and how they were able to forge the empire.
Mm-hmm. Well, so this is a very important point. So much of the Eurasian landmass is made up of this band of dry grassland called steppe. So this is the Great Eurasian Steppe, which stretches essentially from Hungary through to Mongolia proper. And now this is up until quite recently been dominated by people who lived as nomads, steppe pastoralists. So they lived out of felt tents called yurts, gers, and herded horse, sheep, goat, camel, and cattle, and lived off of these products, and they are famous as horse archers predominantly. Now you see from the Scythians through to the Huns, very numerous Turkic peoples, of course the Mongols, the Timurids, the Dzungars, all of these people living on horseback, practicing archery every day, became formidable warriors. And throughout history, from the borders of China to Europe, across the Islamic world, Central Asia, nomadic horse archers are some of the most fearsome warriors and effective warriors you can come across. So the Mongols' form of warfare is still dominated by these lightly armored horse archers. And they don't invent this, as you'll sometimes hear people say things amounting to that, but they kind of perfect it in certain ways. And they use the steppe in a way as a sort of highway across Asia. It's perfect landscape for raising vast herds of horses. So for one thing, these nomadic armies, especially the Mongol armies, had a tremendous amount of horses when many medieval societies are struggling to outfit, I don't know, a tenth of their troops on horseback. So the Mongols always have, because of their lifestyle, their environment, greater mobility, greater long-range firepower compared to a significant number of their enemy. And this is a huge advantage in a medieval context. Now, we should note one stereotype here. The steppes are not empty land. These are not, nomadism is not aimless wandering wherever people want to go. These lands are divided into pastures. People are supposed to follow specific routes within these. And they are assigned to lands. And in exchange for these assigned to lands, people owe labor, military service, taxation to their overlord. So it's kind of, imagine the steppes are divided into this huge kind of feudal division. Every plot of land assigned to members of whatever family is ruling it. So in the 13th and 14th century, this is mainly the Mongol royal family. And over the course of the 13th century, the western end of these steppes are assigned to the family of Chinggis Khan's eldest son, Jochi. This becomes the nucleus of the Golden Horde. So essentially all the lands west of the Irtysh River, imagine from modern Kazakhstan all the way west through Russia, Ukraine, to the very borders of Hungary. This was all part of the Golden Horde, as we call it today. And maybe it was called at the time. The naming is kind of a fun topic in and of itself, but it's easier for now to think of it as the Golden Horde or the Ulus or Khanate of Jochi. The rulers of the Golden Horde were all the descendants of Jochi.
As I mentioned, it wasn't just the Golden Horde. There were several, like the Blue Horde, I think they were called as well. There were several, not just the Golden Horde. There were several divisions, if you will. So let's talk about several other divisions as well before moving on.
So we have to deal with then the name. So what Golden Horde signifies. Firstly, you'll sometimes hear people say Golden Horde, this is a name invented by the Russians in the 1600s or something. We actually see the term Golden Horde appear in the 13th century, not to this Khanate, but to the palace of the great Khan. The word horde in English, horde, comes from Turkic and Mongol ordu, which means like an army command or a palace tent or this kind of command center. And so the ordu, in any case, this is, you can think of this like the general or the prince, his retinue, his generals, his family, they're together. This is where the army command is, or his court in a way. And when it's golden in Mongolian, Altan, in Turkish Altın, this means the center. To Mongols and Turks, and actually many people as well, there are certain colors associated with directions. For the center, this color is gold. So Altan Ordu, Old Orda, this is the golden center. This is the golden court, and this is how we see certain travelers refer to the tents of the great Khan, or like his specific kind of where he's holding court is the Altan Orda. So it could be that the original use of Altan Orda, a Golden Horde, is just to the tent of, or the command center of the Khan of the Jochid Ulus, the Jochid states, sort of like how we might use Washington to refer to the United States, or Downing Street to refer to the British government, this kind of thing. Now, that's kind of generates a bit later. When we're actually discussing how did this look in the early 13th century, though, these lands are given to the sons of Jochi. And now Jochi, he is, we can say, well, one detail that comes across about him in sources is that he had lots of children, many, many sons. In one source, Rashid al-Din, he mentions that Jochi had 40 sons, but he only names 13 of them.
That'll be a hell of a Christmas.
It was a lot of sons, a lot of daughters who go unnamed, probably a lot of bastard children as well. So each of the most important of Jochi's sons are his oldest sons. These are Orda. So again, this Ordu name. Orda, this is Jochi's oldest son, and Batu. This is Jochi's second son. Now, it's pretty much standard in the Mongol and Turkic hierarchies is that things are divided into a left and a right hand. And this is when Jochi dies in 1225, most likely 1225, Chinggis Khan gives the holdings of Jochi's family to the sons and appoints, and basically this east-west division. For some reason, Batu is made the senior in rank over his older brother Orda. It's not really clear why. Maybe he's Jochi's favorite or something, or seen as more competent, or whatever.
Was it kind of like in the Ottoman Turks that if you wanted to become a sultan, you had to kill your brothers? Was that the case in Mongol?
No, it is. We don't see very much of that. You do see some purges and civil wars, but there's not a dedicated system of murdering the brothers or something. And we don't really get this. There isn't a great indication of necessarily animosity between Batu and Orda, but there is some sort of division. And the thing is, Batu, he is senior, but he is not overlord to Orda for whatever reason. So these lands are divided, and it seems that Orda's territory is essentially totally autonomous, that Batu doesn't really have any control in it, but he has some degree of influence there. And this is, when we actually deal with the history of the Golden Horde in the 13th century, this seems to be the case with the successors to each of these brothers. That this is essentially two halves, called a white and a blue horde, up until the early 1300s, when the Khans of the western half of the so-called Golden Horde bring the line of Orda under their rule. Now, I'm sort of dodging around the names here because this is a great deal of controversy over which one of these was the White Horde and which one of these was the Blue Horde, because it changes in different sources. So, as I mentioned, there's colors are associated with directions here. So normally white, Ak, is associated with the west, and blue, Gurk, is associated with the east. Except, so you would expect the White Horde to be the western and Blue Horde to be the eastern, or the White Horde being ruled by the line of Batu, Blue Horde being ruled by the line of Orda. Except some sources switch this around, so then Blue Horde becomes the west, White Horde becomes the east. I'm of the opinion that the White Horde was the west and Blue Horde was the east. This seems more likely to me. It seems kind of weird that they would have switched this up, but I find it usually to dodge around that. I call it the Ulus of Batu and Ulus of Orda, because one's ruled by the line of Batu and one's ruled by the line of Orda, and this sort of stays how things go until about 1360 or so. Now, you might also have had other divisions within that, because all of the descendants of Jochi, all of his sons, would have had ordus, or lands within this. And maybe they all had color designations, but we don't really get a good depiction of this until substantially later. So in sources of these 16th century, I believe, some Turkic chronicles, when writing for rulers who are descendant from some of Jochi's lesser children, they will then say that their ancestor, who was the son of Jochi, but not Batu or Orda, but one of his other many sons, says, oh, at the same time that we get to this blue horde and white horde, and we see this, I forget what it is now, gray horde, silver horde, maybe?
I heard silver horde from what I
might
read
be.
about.
I don't remember right at this moment. But then we see things like that. They'll say, and this is probably retroactive, making this tripartite division, because this is not apparent in the 13th or 14th century sources. It might have been there, but maybe not under that name. So the kind of the end result of all that is when we're dealing with the Golden Horde, we're kind of dealing with something kind of uncertain name and kind of uncertain divisions within it, and uncertain name of those divisions. Now, part of the reason for this uncertainty is that we don't have any sources from the Golden Horde itself for this period. Now, there is a stereotype that the Mongols, that we don't have sources from the Mongol Empire, that they're all written by their enemies. This is not true. We do see some indigenous sources written in the Mongol language, most notably the secret history of the Mongols, but there's also some inscriptions and other things written in Mongolian. But you also see in the other divisions of the Great Mongol Empire, in Mongol-ruled China, you see a number of histories there written in Chinese and probably with Mongolian originals that are now lost. And in the Ilkhanate, this is the division of the Mongol Empire ruling today's Middle East, also writes a number of Persian language sources and Arabic language sources. Now, probably the reason we have sources for these two Khanates and not the other Khanates, these blue white hordes and Chagatai Khanate, the other Mongol Khanate in Central Asia, these other Khanates probably did not have any local chronicle writing tradition that they picked up. Or if they did, these were lost in the civil wars and destructions over the 14th century, especially following the Black Death. Or in the Golden Horde, the invasion of Emir Timur, Tamerlane, a Central Asian conqueror, he came in and he sacked essentially every major city of the Golden Horde, all of its capitals and everything. And whatever written material was there, if not historical chronicles, then charters, census data, whatever, notices, all of these things were carried off, destroyed, burnt. These cities were abandoned. These documents were left to the elements and been lost. And with Russian expansion of the Russian Empire eastwards not Russian Empire yet, still just be Muscovy. Under Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century, then you see another round of looting of whatever was left of these cities, essentially. So whatever material might have been left is long gone by now. And this means when we discuss the history of the Golden Horde, we're discussing its history essentially all from outsiders who had many different opinions about it. So we have material about the Golden Horde from Mongol sources, so from the Yuan dynasty in Chinese, from the Ilkhanites and its successors, including the Timurids, were largely in Persian, they are mostly antagonistic to the Golden Horde. You have stuff on the Golden Horde from the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, written in Arabic, which is actually one of our most important sources on the Golden Horde's internal history. You have stuff in Greek from the Byzantine Empire. You have material from the Rus principalities written in Old Church Slavonic. And you have material in Latin from Franciscan missionaries who worked in the Golden Horde. And then we have, as I mentioned a little earlier, we have this later Turkic chronicle tradition, which reused some of these older Persian works, but also appears to have incorporated some oral folk tales from the former lands of the Golden Horde. So, and then this is all buffeted by archaeology. So numismatic data, the ruins of cities, the Golden Horde in the steppe, when it is enforced this period of peace on the steppes, prevents raiding and stuff. They establish a number of quite large settlements, urban centers running across the steppes. The most notable of these were Sarai al-Jadid. So this is the palace. And these are quite large cities. Ibn Battuta, the famous traveler, he stops in these cities as part of his journeys. He calls them some of the largest cities he's ever been to. And you had obviously Mongols there, you had local Turkic peoples. We know they also brought Rus peoples east with them. And also there were peoples from Central Asia, Central Asian Muslims, Turks, Persian, Arabs there. We have Ibn Battuta encounters Greeks in these cities, Indians, even Jewish diaspora from Spain he encounters there. They were large, like huge craft production centers, and there's just fascinating information on these and how they incorporated or how they were part of the Golden Horde's economy, and indeed the economy of the 13th and 14th century world, because these are obviously, we've all heard of the Silk Road, and these are sort of your quintessential Silk Road cities growing rich and fat off of the Silk Roads. And then when these systems are broken up because of the Black Death and disintegration of these Mongol Khanates in the late 14th century, and also with invasions by Timur Muscovy, these cities are largely collapsed and are abandoned by the 16th century, with a handful that managed to hold on. Perhaps the most notable being what's today Astrakhan, was established, I believe, in the 14th century. So
let's talk. Do you know what age you started training to become in the Golden Horde, and was there any requirements to become part of the Golden Horde? And as you mentioned, they were fierce horse warriors. And what are some tactics they used when? Because there was three, and again, Frank McLean mentioned this. It's three infamous tactics that the Golden Horde used when they were in campaign. So let's talk a little bit about training and tactics used by the Golden Horde.
So there's a great sort of saying about this, where for Turkic and Mongolian nomads, there is no distinction between a civilian and a warrior. The word for man in these languages, as it is in the modern forms, just means warrior. So like erkek in modern Turkish, it means a warrior, a fighter, because every man who could ride a horse and shoot a bow was a warrior and could be called up for war. We see a number of sources state things along the lines of every man between age 15 and 60 was expected to fight. Now, kind of the years kind of change on this. Some sources will be like, 14 to 50, but it's this kind of expectation that every able-bodied person in the society can partake in war. And this is why these nomadic societies are able to field quite large armies compared to their sedentary neighbors, is because a larger percentage of the population is actually fit for combat, just because of their own lifestyle. Literally, the children would be put on the back of the horse before they could walk and like tied into a saddle. So they could, from the youngest age
doesn't
possible.
Sound traumatic at all.
It's fun. I did similar things growing up in Canada, actually. So from the young age, the children, they get the balance, endurance, and sort of the ability to sit comfortably on horse, literally spending their entire lives on horseback. Now, you can train to be a horse rider, or you can grow up as one. You can be raised one. And the difference in riding ability between these two types, uncomparable. So it's from young age, you're basically living on the back of a horse and you're shooting a bow every day.
Now,
So this is
something
also
I want to ask about. Sorry for interrupting you. I thought it there, but I want to ask because before we moving on, was I just want to get a certain way was because in Europe, as you know, at the time until the Janissaries, there was no real standing army. Was the Golden Horde a standing army, or did they just crawl in whenever they were required during the combat?
The army would not be mobilized outside of going on campaign. But this is the thing, as we're getting to here, when everyone's in horseback in these systems, they can be mobilized quite quickly. Their whole camps for most people in society can be cleaned up and put onto the back of a wagon, literally, and then carried off with them while they go on campaign. So because everyone is on horseback, has their own horse, is bringing their own horse to battles, bringing their own bows, this is essentially the two elements they need the most. And having swords, daggers, spears, these are all secondary because all of their tactics and all of their strategies are built around maximizing this mobility and firepower. It's about outmaneuvering the enemy and doing as much damage as you can to them from far away. And all of their tactics emphasize this. This is across the Mongol Empire, across all nomadic states, and especially in the Golden Horde as well. Metal production is not impossible on the steppe. I'm working on a project right now that's I'm going to put on my own channel and some other articles and stuff that's going to go into this metal production aspect. But so there is metal production in the steppes. So wealthier peoples are having access to armor, swords, all these things. So it is possible to get these things, but it's not necessary. Because if you're able to kill your enemy from 30 meters away and he can't touch you, why would you want to get closer?
Yeah.
There's putting more armor on yourself. It's just putting more weight on you and your horse. Not necessarily slowing you down, but tiring the horse out more. Maybe you can't move quite as quick. If you feel like you're just going to get out of the way of the enemy's arrows, then why are you putting a bunch of armor on yourself? And this is, in fact, what we see in a lot of the sources. There is sort of this interesting phenomenon where, because the Golden Horde is often antagonistic to its neighbors to the south, first the Ilkhanate, then the Ilkhanate successor states, and then the Timurids under Timur and his successors. And there is a consistent stereotype in all of these sources that the Khan of the Golden Horde has a nearly endless supply of warriors, but that they're all very poorly armored. They have very little actual equipment. And this doesn't mean they're bad fighters by any means. They're not fearsome, but the general indication is there's not a lot of armor on these guys, that the tactics are going to be a lot of hit and run, a lot of skirmishing. One of the tactics we see often associated with the Mongols is the Mongol army breaking up into small parties, and that they're running at the enemy in sort of these small groups. They'll run up, they'll charge, they'll shoot arrows at them, they'll ride back, and then they'll do what's called the Parthian shot. So that's the famous, you sit on horseback, you shoot backwards like that while you're riding away and shooting an arrow back at the guys on the other side. So this does a couple things. Obviously, you're shooting arrows at the guys. That's not nice for the guys on the receiving end of that. These are very powerful bows, strong arrows. In most cases, an enemy army isn't going to be completely covered in armor and things. So you have uneven quality of armor. The arrows, if they're not killing, they're injuring, they're frightening guys. For the guys standing there, they don't know which one of these charges are going to turn into an actual charge into their lines or pull away. It's quite difficult to stand in place while a bunch of horses run at you. I have been in situations in my life where I've had cattle, for instance, a herd of cattle run at me. We were doing branding, and we had to sort of corral them into a section of the pasture. And at one point, I ended up kind of standing in front of the herd while they all ran at me. And the sensation of sort of the earth shaking, this the sound of all their on their hooves as they beat the ground, and just this sort of mass of flesh coming at you. You can't really wrap your mind around it until you're on the other side of that. And there wasn't even guys on top of the cows trying to kill me at the same time. And I remember sort of this clear voice in my head going, this is a bad place to be standing right now. So we have to imagine 13th, 14th century, you have one army standing there, all these horses are running at them, guys shooting arrows at them. Your instincts, if you are not a very well-trained or disciplined force, are going to be run away from that, in which case the Mongols pursue you. And when a formation is broken, that is when most of the fatalities occur in medieval combat, when one side's basically stopped fighting and started running. So
it is a brilliant tactic.
So dude, it's about maximizing your strengths and minimizing your weaknesses, playing to your strengths, playing to the enemy weaknesses. So if the enemy flees, you run in pursuit. If he chases you, then we get to the most famous of all nomadic tactics, the feigned retreat. So this is when the enemy breaks formation to pursue the horsemen while they're running away. So at the same time, the nomads are shooting arrows back at the enemy until they pull them quite a distance away from the rest of the enemy force, in which case then more nomads left in waiting or left in hiding, they regroup and then they surround this force which has now left the position, which is now isolated, and they fall upon it and they invariably destroy it. This is literally oldest trick in the book kind of thing, and you will be shocked when you read the sources how consistently it works. Everyone falls for it.
And from what I understood as well, they could do this feigned retreat for days and then just to bother the hell out of the opponents, and finally they would charge and just destroy them.
Yeah, well, a good feigned retreat looks like a real retreat, and this is where people so what I mentioned, the Mongols, your guys break formation, Mongols pursue and fall,
right,
and cut them down. So this is what the other guys are now trying to do. In this case, this is what they think they're going to do. And remember, if you're just standing there and guys are shooting at you and you can't do anything, your instinct is going to be run away or try and get them. You're angry. They've come in here. They've been burning your villages, destroying farmland, slaughtering people. Now they're killing your buddies around you. You want to get back at them. You want to swing your axe. You want to charge at them. This is normally the enemy cavalry who breaking the formation for this. And they just think, those guys, those nomads, those Mongols, they're so lightly armored. If I can only get close to them, I'll cut down and I'll kill the lot of them. And it's this overconfidence, which is this need to strike back, is what we see happen again and again. They leave formation, pursue a feigned retreat, and they're killed. We even see in China, during the start of Mongol campaigns in North China against the Jin dynasty, we see garrisons within these cities will leave their formations or leave the city to pursue the Mongols and get drawn into feigned retreats. And this was how the Mongols, before they even learned how to get through city walls, are able to take so many cities in northern China so quickly, because the Chinese, the Jurchen, the Khitan defenders keep doing this.
They really perfected the fool me once, fool me twice.
It's when we do see in sources people like begging, don't fall for this. If you see the nomads run, don't pursue them, because people recognize this is a problem.
Yeah.
But it's easy to say that on a piece of paper, don't do this, and obviously these things look obvious in hindsight. But it's a different thing when you have the mentality of being on the battlefield in this. Now,
the adrenaline, right?
Well, exactly. Adrenaline. You want to fight. It's mentally, I'd imagine, the most difficult thing you can be told to do is just stand there and take it.
I would be just standing there. Hey, they don't get you. What's the point? Just, okay, no, don't listen to me. Fine. That's fine.
So if you do have an occasion, though, when the army just stands there, and they have nice big shields. So imagine a nice disciplined group of hoplites, right? They have their shields up and getting arrows in their shields. They're not chasing over after the Mongols. So what happens in this case? So the Mongols, and we have the sources, they explain what happens. The Mongols will leave a small group to sort of keep this enemy army there in position, hold them, and then they'll move around. They'll try and flank them. There's some cases they'll drive cattle into the enemy formation, like because they're bringing their herds with them, or they'll take local herds, drive them into the enemy formation, or they just leave and start attacking other things. And now the army who's left in their formation here is standing there going, that's a bunch of smoke coming up over the hill. They're burning our villages. They're killing more of our people here. Do we just stand here? And the Mongols are perfectly happy to leave the enemy army there indefinitely and potentially run out of supplies, run out of water, and then they have to start sending out foragers who the Mongols are going to try and pick off. And it's like there's so much more elements to this. This is why nomadic armies are so dangerous. As I said, this mobility, this firepower aspect. Even if your side is really very disciplined, has nice equipment, good armor, they're not going to fall for feigned retreats. You still have to deal with the fact that to the Mongols, there's no advantage in forcing a pitched battle. There's very little interest in getting close with the enemy. Now, the Mongols, they do have their own heavy cavalry. We have visual depictions of it, archaeological remains, textual descriptions of it, and it's mostly kind of employed kind of this last resort or to break a opening in the enemy lines, or you have these feigned retreat examples here, or they will have subject peoples who the Mongols consider more expendable, who they will send against a force like this. But in general, the rest of the army, very lightly armored, has lots of arrows. Why do you want them to risk their lives? These are very valuable troops. You don't want them risking their lives in the close quarters engagement. That's needless losses.
Now, I want to add that regarding the faint retreat one that we spoke about now, and we discussed this in our Ottoman Sultan episode, part 1, where the early Ottoman Turks, they do copy this faint retreat, and that's what made them so successful when the Osman made these 300 quote-unquote horse warriors. They do kind of copy this faint retreat, and it works for them as well. It works brilliantly. That's one of the reasons why the Ottomans became successful later on.
No, nomads aren't the only ones who employ this. Other people are aware of this. You see this throughout the centuries of military history everywhere. It's just nomadic armies armies with lots of horses are very good at implementing it. And this is the qualitative difference between these two forces. So I'd imagine you look in The Art of War, there's probably something in there about that as well. Like this is not a new trick. If I'm remembering correctly, there's supposed to be some Scythian victory over Cyrus the Great, and it might be legendary kind of thing, but supposedly one of the ways Cyrus the Great is killed is he falls for a feigned retreat, or his army is destroyed through one. So and this is like a good I want to say 1500 years before Genghis Khan. Like these are not new tactics the Mongols or the Golden Horde are employing. These are the tools of nomadic armies. The Mongols are sort of the latest and perhaps the greatest to use them. And you might, again, why don't people learn? They do learn, and there actually are a couple cases where it gets employed against the Mongols themselves, sometimes by other Mongol armies during the civil wars. So it's not that the Mongols can't fall for it, but again, there's not that many. An army is a complicated thing to run, and there isn't generally a lot of innovation in some of the tricks armies use against each other. If they work, there's a reason they work, that things have to be somewhat simple in concept in order to get a large number of people to pull them off successfully.
Right. Was there a hierarchy in the Golden Horde? Like, if I wanted to become a general, did I have to be born like in Europe in noble family to be, or if you was experience valued, like with the Janissaries? Again, I want to compare to the Ottoman Turks, but with the Janissaries, experience was valued. So if you could become a general without being a nobility. But was this the case in Mongol Golden Horde? You had to be of noble birth in order to lead the army.
You'll often hear about the Mongol meritocracy system, that the Mongols only promoted based on merit. This is somewhat overstated. It is slightly true, especially in the early Mongol Empire. But the thing is, all the positions of power in the Mongol states are hereditary. So this is part of the reason why people want them and why there's such an honor to have them, is because it's not just you who gets them, your descendants can get them as well. So what happens rather quickly in the Mongol Empire, you get kind of this two levels of nobility. You have the Alton Urog, the golden lineage. So this is the family of Genghis Khan and his descendants. And then you have the Noyad, or the Harachu. So this is the military elite. And this is generally the people who are descendants of the generals who were appointed in the early years of the Mongol Empire. And you see these same families coming to power again and again across the Mongol Khanates and their successor states. Interestingly, in the Golden Horde, almost all of our named commanders of armies are members of the royal family. There are very few occasions where we see any non-Chinggisids leading any sort of armies in the Golden Horde. There's very little indication of anyone rising through the ranks, or anyone who's not a member of the royal family is adjacent to it. They get rewarded with a marriage to a Chinggisid bride, or they already have some sort of power base, that they're already the lord of some region in the empire. So they're a part of this secondary nobility level.
Now let's talk about besieging a city, because that happened quite a lot as well. And you had, I believe there was two choices you had in besieging a city. One, you could surrender and you would spare, or two, you could not, and Lord help yourself. So how did the Mongols have techniques to besiege a city? We talked about this in the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate with Peter Trontsienko, whom I know you know. But they did have siege engine, at least by the time of Baghdad. But before Baghdad, did they have siege engines like trebuchets, or did they just try to start them out when they besieged the city, or how did the techniques there work?
So we touched on this very briefly with the feigned retreats. Right. So the Mongols are initially just employing feigned retreats to get garrisons to leave their position. We see the Mongols in the very first years of conquest, like we're looking at the very first 2 or 3 years of the wars in China, they don't know how to take cities. So we're seeing these feigned retreats. We see the most famous example is they try and divert a river to undermine a city and accidentally flood their own camp in the process.
That backfired.
It worked in the end, but it was kind of a bit of egg on their face.
Yeah.
But they learn quite quickly, because they capture people who know what to do. Or in the wars against the Jin dynasty, we see a massive amount of defections. By the time the Mongols invade the Jin dynasty, the rulers of the Jin dynasty, so the dynasty ruling northern China, they're hated, they're seen as incompetent. The army was this horrible, you had like this 3-tier ethnic hierarchy. So The Jin dynasty was ruled by people called the Jurchen. So they're the ancestors of the Manchu, who founded Qing dynasty in the 17th century. So basically all the top positions, important positions in the Jin dynasty army are held by the Jurchen. And then you have like these two other ethnic groups. So the northern Chinese, the Han Chinese peoples, and also the Khitans. So the Khitans, they'd ruled previously a dynasty in North China, the Lao dynasty, which was conquered by the Jin in the early 12th century. But much of this population remained in China, and they were very similar to the Mongols. They spoke a language adjacent to Mongolian. They often hear it called para-Mongolic. So they also fought on horseback with bows and things, and so did the Jurchen. But there was a lot of animosity between them. And what Chinggis Khan did was appeal to this animosity and convince thousands and thousands of defectors every year to join him. They were actually, allegedly, Khitan and Chinese defectors were joining him even before he invaded China in the first place. But these defections grow so great that by 1216, only 5 years into the Mongol conquests, there are more Chinese fighting for the Mongols in China than there are Mongols fighting in China. This is huge. We see specifically
that is fascinating.
There's entire siege companies of siege engineers who know how to work and build these siege machines. They joined the Mongols. I think the first mentioned one in the sources, I want to say 1213, 1213, 1214. This is kind of, there's not that we should get too deep into the details here, but the first 2 or 3 years of the Mongol attacks on North China. So this starts 1211, the War of the Jin Dynasty. For the first year or two, rather, it's almost like the Mongols aren't sure what they want to do. If they just want to raid, because the first year, they'll attack and then they leave, and then they don't even fortify the border passes that they captured. And then they kind of realize, oh, we have to retake these things if we want to keep raiding. And sort of over 1213 is this hinge switches, and they go from, we actually have to start holding on to some of this territory here, and they start really building an army that can actually reliably start assaulting these hard points. And then you see, almost right away, they love these guys. They love carpenters, craftsmen, stonemasons, engineers. And this is sort of famous across the Mongol conquests, is when they take a city, it's these skilled peoples who are taken into the army and put into these positions to building weapons for taking cities. So in the form of catapults, siege ladders, shelters for approaching the walls, battering rams, guys to undermine the walls, all sorts of positions. And they also incorporate forced labor. So all of their prisoners have to go before the army, basically as arrow fodder, pushing these machines, filling in the ditches with their bodies even. And meanwhile, the garrison is forced to make the choice between, do I shoot on our own people, or and kill maybe even people I know, or do I allow the Mongols to or these prisoners to carry out the Mongols' plan here, filling in the moats, breaking down the walls? And I imagine psychologically that must have been a horrible choice to make. So this is early on, by literally within the first 5 years of the Mongol conquest, the Mongols have most of the tools that they use across Asia. When they start their attacks against the Islamic powers of Central Asia, so most famously against the Khwarezmian Empire. So the Khwarezmians, it seems kind of their belief going into the war was, okay, we just leave our garrisons in the cities because they are nomads and they don't have the ability to take fortifications. So we can sit comfy in our cities, and these people will come in, they'll make noise, or the nomads will come in, they'll make noise, they'll cause devastation, but they'll leave.
Not this nomad they want.
It was a bad calculation because when the Mongols show up in Central Asia, then they have all the means they need to take cities to take all the fortifications they come across. And even better, the defensive strategy the Khwarezmian state has chosen is one that ensures now these Mongol armies aren't even harassed while they're attacking the walls, because each city is basically being picked off one by one. And this turns it into just this horrific military disaster for the Khwarezmians.
I don't remember where exactly this guy was, but I was reading a book in preparation for this, and there was this guy. He was called Muhammad. He was this ruler. You might know who I'm talking about, but he kind of tried to defy. He was kind of hated by his people, I think. I don't remember his name, but he did fight against the Golden Horde at one point. I can't remember where he was or what city it was, but details. But you might. Does this ring a bell?
Well, there's not a shortage of guys named
That's
Muhammad
fair enough, but
you're probably thinking of Muhammad Khwarizm Shah.
That's it, probably, yeah. I just couldn't remember too much detail, but I remember reading about him, but I couldn't remember.
Yeah,
exactly.
The Khwarizm Shahs were not terribly popular. They were Muhammad in particular, Muhammad II Khwarizm Shah, Allah ad-Din Muhammad. He very cocky man. He and his father greatly expanded the Khwarezmian Empire. In 1217, I believe, he even tries to attack Baghdad and fails. But he thought really highly of himself. He styled himself the second Alexander, as in the second Alexander the Great. And if you know the story of the massacre of the Mongol merchant caravan.
Yeah.
So this is Muhammad's uncle who carries this out at the city of Utrar. And probably this was carried out with some level of approval on the part of Muhammad. Like it's kind of hard to imagine this, like either this was carried out with Muhammad's approval or his influence in the states was even less than might be imagined, that he had this little power over some of his most important vassals. And the part of the reason why sort of this, well, even when Muhammad's son, Jalal al-Din, flees to India and he finds no aid there because people there trusted the Khwarezmians so little they'd rather work with the Mongols.
That says something about your reputation, I think.
He's very they did not have a good their reputation was essentially of treacherous and militaristic and expansionistic, and not like there was a common rumor at the time, well actually a little later, but there was a rumor a little later that the caliph actually invited the Mongols in to attack Muhammad Khwarizm Shah. And I think it kind of speaks to the reputation of the Khwarezmian leadership that people heard that and went, yeah, that sounds about right.
But yeah, one of the things we should mention as well is we talked about the either surrender or they raise the city to the ground. And one of the reasons why the Mongols took land so quickly was because a lot of cities did surrender immediately when they heard the reputation of the Golden Horde and they heard about what they would do if you did not surrender. So, but do you have a percentage of how many cities actually did surrender immediately to the Mongols, or do you have more or less, was it half and half, or?
I would hesitate to make any kind of precise statement on there, even because we see a lot of resistance. The thing is, in the sources, what they talk about is the cities who resist. If a city surrenders without a fight, it generally doesn't go mentioned because it's not as notable, right? It's the massacre, the slaughter, it's destruction. This is what stands out to people, and this is what they write about. So we do have a handful of, like even the Khwarezmian campaign. There are cities who submit, and then they rise up in rebellion, say the next year. And then the Mongols come back and annihilate the city. And some of the worst destruction you see is a city which submit and then later rebels. These are the ones where you get like the pyramids of skulls, and like every living thing in the city is supposed to be killed, down to the rats and dogs, and like utter destruction and these sorts of things. So
strip you away to nothing.
It's like, this is what the level of destruction of city, and obviously the Mongols are famous for it, and you don't want to diminish it or minimize it, rather. But there is sort of a playbook, almost like they have like this level, like fairly consistent kind of level of response to how they treat a city. And obviously the best case scenario is you submit immediately, and usually this follows with Mongol demands for, you provide the army with foodstuffs and you tear down your walls and fortifications. These are pretty consistently the demands. And then often it's provide troops as well, allows to put a Mongol official in charge of your city. So this is like your base level. This is what's, if you just submit right away, this is what you have to do.
Right.
And it's not a minor thing to demolish all of your fortifications, but we do see people do this, not infrequently, but again, it's often kind of minimized in the sources, because people really, part of the reason they want to harp on the destruction, if you're a writer who hates the Mongols, you focus on the destruction because you want to highlight heroic resistance, but also look how terrible this enemy is. Look how much slaughter they've caused. You want to galvanize further resistance, like a unified resistance this time. If you're a writer who is working for the Mongols, you mention the destruction because you want to go, this is the punishment for resistance. And they, in that case, then they'll also overstate it. Like some of our most exaggerated figures for losses in these cities come from people who worked for the Mongols. And they'll say 2 million people were killed here, 1 million people were killed here, because they want you to associate that with Mongol rule. Not because they want you to hate them, or maybe they do, but because they want you to know what the price is for resistance, that there is no way to resist effectively.
Speaking of taking over control of cities, one of the things, and I want to focus on Russia here, between medieval Russia, because one of the things you had to do was that you had to go to the capital of the Khan. You had to pay tribute to him personally if you were the Tsar or if you were the ruler of the city. You had to, and it took quite a lot of time. If you think that taking a plane from Europe to US or Canada takes time today, it took quite some time. You do have this famous story of this. So now let's talk about this journey, because it took, I believe, 6 years, either one way or back and forth. It was 6 years together, back and forth, especially from Russia. If you're talking Moscow area, you do have the story of this one guy who had to go when one went time. I don't forget his name, but he had to go to the Khan, pay tribute to him. Then he went back, and then he wrote order. Oh wait, you have to do this all over again. And it took, like you said, it took time, quite a significant amount of your time of your life in these vast distances, right? So let's talk about being a vassal for the Golden Horde and the Mongols.
So the expectation was for when there was a new ruler, either when you succeed to your throne locally or a new Khan is enthroned, that you should, as a good vassal, go in person or send a representative to the court of the Khan. Now we have cases of Rus princes, Armenian princes, Georgian princes going, and across the Islamic world as well, going all the way to the Mongol imperial capital of Karakorum in Mongolia in making this journey. And these guys, like they'd be gone for years. They don't actually, the journey itself usually takes about a year if you're in this farther parts of or 6 months to a year, kind of depending. Right. But then they usually spend a couple years in the court actually, and they get sent back. and it could be you could be punished if you failed to do this, or kind of late, or especially if the Mongols requested you do it and you refuse to. Now, this is we see, for example, in Syria,
Right.
some Ayyubid princes there, they submit to the Mongols and then stop being cooperative and don't appear in person. Or also in Seljuk, Anatolia, Seljuks of Rum, same thing happens there. And when this happens, the Mongol army comes in and you get punished quite violently.
But a lot of this, and again, I studied Russia because I read about the medieval Russia a while ago, so that's my reference to this. That a lot of them, especially, would be looked as martyrs if this happened, right? That if they were sacrificed by the Golden Horde, they were more or less martyrs.
Later on, more so. There's first of all, it does become in the Golden Horde, the princes of the Rus principalities, it's called going to the Horde. They have to go to the Khan of the Horde and his encampment, usually at Sarai, and pay their respects, and they receive what's called a yarlik, so like a decree, like enthroning them. And this could be, first of all, it's just a dangerous long journey in the first place, even if nothing happens to you at the court. But we often see things do happen to these princes at the court, so they'll do something to disrespect the Mongols. So there's one very early on, like this is under Batu, and if I'm remembering right, it's like 1248, maybe 1250, in around there. One of the Rus princes, he goes to Batu's court and he refuses to basically bow towards an image of Chinggis Khan. And he does a couple other things as well that annoy the Mongols too. He was hated by like all of the other Rus princes, so this just wasn't the guy who got along with people in general. But he and his grandson, who was with him, both end up being executed on Mongol order. Now, later on, he becomes like a martyr and like a saint in sort of, I think, 16th century, if I'm remembering correctly. But at the time, these deaths, what they actually serve when they appear in the earlier chronicles, like the Halichnio-Volhynian Chronicle, these deaths of princes, they serve as a warning that this is what happens if you go to the court and you piss off the Khan, or if you don't go to the court, that you will be punished.
What about it sent back to their respected cities, or whether they just like severed heads sent back to see that if you don't respect us, they would how was the message sent?
By the survivors. They don't. The Mongols generally aren't that big on ripping a guy apart and sending the body parts back. Like, not that I can't really think of any examples off the top of my head. I think they just send like whoever, because the prince, this Rus prince, he's not going by himself, right? He would have had an entourage with him, other family members, and whoever's surviving from that group is going back and carrying the message, and probably the Khan's demand for send a new prince that I can enthrone, or I've declared such and such family member or relation or other person I like, he's now the prince in charge. What's interesting about, and it sort of in the historical memory of this becomes, the princes resisting the Khans and things. But what actually happens is the Rus princes fall in line very quickly. The Rus princes and the Rus church both end up basically enticed to support the Mongols through these threats, but also privileges. So the Mongols grant tax exemptions to some of these institutions, especially the church, and they say, okay, if you pray for our success and longevity, you don't have to pay these taxes on your lands, on your servants or whatever. You don't have to do corvée labor, so you don't have to do labor, like you and your people and your the people on your lands, your peasants, your serfs, they don't have to come and work for us on our projects in our cities. This is a big deal. And they like this and they get on it pretty quickly and they fall in line. The Rus princes, not immediately, but fairly quickly end up becoming the tax collectors on behalf of the Khan. And if you're collecting taxes for the Khan, do you know what you get? Some of those taxes, you get the money on top of that. You can skim from the bag. And it, especially in the early 14th century, the Rus princes are competing to become the Veliki Knyaz, the great prince, the grand prince. So the chief prince, who is the chief tax collector. And the chief tax collector gets the most privileges, gets the most amount of that extra revenue. And the Khan, it used to be initially for the position of grand prince, all the Mongols would do would be recognize the local tradition. They would say, whoever you put forward, we will confirm him. What happens in the 14th century under the powerful Uzbek Khan, now the Mongols become the one deciding who the grand prince is, and they pick, like, you are my favorite here. We get some of these princes spend years at the Mongol court, even marry Mongol princesses in order to gain this favor and go back with it. Because when you have that favor, you also get Mongol military support. And the Mongols quite regularly send armies into the Rus lands, not to raid in general, but to back a specific prince.
Too, I assume.
Yeah, and raid his enemies' lands, help prop him up. So they get, like I said, the Rus princes, they fall in line. And probably wasn't a very good experience for the people at the bottom of the social ladder. Neither the Mongols or the Rus princes cared very much, as long as they all got their slice of the pie.
Seems to be the case in this day of age in Russia as well.
Not too much changes. Like I said, people after the fact, you get the historical memory of resistance. And they go, oh, the princes are always resisting and trying to, the independence of Russia and stuff. No, they didn't care. There was no idea of a unified Russia, right? Russia isn't existing until centuries after this. These are princes of Rus.
Peter the Great, more or less.
Yes. They're princes of whatever their principality is. And they also change this principality all the time. So there's no nationalism aspect. There isn't any great crusade to throw off the Mongol yoke. Like you'll sometimes see on maps, when people do a map of the Golden Horde, they'll show the Rus principalities as somehow distinct, as like outside of this and just paying tribute. No, all the information we have suggests the Rus princes were incorporated into the Golden Horde and Mongol Empire in the same way everyone else was. That they had the same requirements as every other vassal, providing troops. When we know Rus princes and their retinues and troops often fought for the Mongols. Some even, it's not great evidence for this, or great detail on this rather, but some of them were even sent to fight in China against the Song dynasty in southern China. But we also see them fighting in the Caucasus. We also see them accompanying Mongol armies or Golden Horde armies into Central Europe against Poland and Hungary. Also against, they're taking part in civil wars between Golden Horde factions, taking part in warfare in the Caucasus. So the Rus are providing troops. We know they're demolishing their fortifications. We know they're paying tribute. They're allowing Mongol census takers into their lands so the Mongols can record the populations to make their assessments for taxation, all these things. So it's the same tribute demands of a vassal as every other Mongol vassal. The only difference is the Mongols haven't come through here and uniformly replaced all of the Rus princes with someone from Central Asia. But there are times, probably from the Mongol point of view, they did think they did this, because we know they're tax collectors in these regions, like the overseers are these people from who are Turks, who are from Central Asia, who are Muslims. And they're very rarely mentioned in the Rus sources, in the Rus chronicles, mainly because the Rus chronicles really like to downplay this vassal aspect. But they don't like mentioning, like they only really mention the Mongols when it's like, oh, in such and such year, Prince X went to see the Khan, and he came back a couple of years later, or in such year, Mongol army came through, or a Tartar army, as they call it, came through Rus, or in this year we had census collectors came. Like they only speak about these direct interactions. They don't talk about the system as a whole or how it looks from up above. And of course, the Russian historiography you like to really emphasize is, oh, we weren't really conquered, you know. And you do deal with some nationalists on the internet today who share the same opinion, who they want Russia, not that it was Russia at the time, but the Rus princes. They want the Rus princes to have been removed from the system.
Right. Something that you mentioned earlier, I don't want to go into a little more detail before we get to Tamerlane, is that you mentioned the Silk Road, which brought vast taxation revenue for the Mongols when they conquered the city. So how did they go on protecting, again, quote unquote, these Silk Roads for their own gain, and how successful were they at doing this protection, more or less?
Immensely successful. So if you remember at the start of our discussion today, I mentioned sort of this feudal division of lands across all of Asia under the Mongol Empire. And so before the Mongol rule in the Western steppes in Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan today, all of this was held, all these steppes were held by Turkic nomads called the Kuman Kipchaks, and a variety, and like a dozen other names as well. But essentially, there was not a Kuman Kipchak state. It's sometimes called a Kuman Kipchak confederation. There isn't any evidence for kind of any higher level organization between them. So it's essentially, essentially like all these little Kuman Kipchak Turkic principalities, like all on their own, or Khanates even, but we don't know what titles they held. So they'd raid each other, and this is very dangerous territory for traveling. Merchants don't go through there. The Mongols come through. They displace a huge number of these people, of these Turkic nomads, Kipchaks. They reorganize society. They appoint their guys in charge, and they subjugate it. And now, with all of these steppes now divided into appanage, ulus, lands of the Golden Horde, it's peace. Like it's peace at the point of a sword.
Mongolia, more or less.
It really is this concept, and one of its best forms here is the Mongols turn the steppes into there's no more raiding. Like you might get harassed by the Mongols in charge of it, and we see this happen to people who do make the journey and record it, but you're not actively being assaulted in these by a raiding party from rival groups in the steppe. So
they weren't like the Italian mafia. You pay us protection money, we will protect you. Was it kind of like that?
In a lot of respects, yes. But what the Mongols also do is then they take, once they've done this, as in they take efforts to then promote the trade over the routes. So there's lots of rivers in the steppes, in the Western steppes, that run north-south. So things like the Volga River, Don River, Dnipro, a lot of rivers that are, unfortunately, we are hearing the names of a lot in the news today with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But these are not easy rivers to cross. But what the Mongols do is they often displace, with some of these displaced people, Slavic peoples from the Rus principalities, or these Kipchak peoples, is they basically force these communities to the river crossings to permanently man ferries over the rivers to ease the routes of cross. So you have, and to some extent, there's promotion of the caravan trade. So we know in the early cities of the Golden Horde, or the camp settlements, is you get the caravanserais. So the facilities put in place to service the merchants who do make the journey. So either where they can trade things.
I would kind of probably was kind of like a gas station in today's world.
Yeah, kind of convenience kind of stop. And these centers, so Sarai, Ukek, Ajitarhan, or the various cities of the Golden Horde, these centers, they grow as more and more trade. Now, this trade extends all the way to Mongol-ruled China, through Mongol-ruled Central Asia. Well, even with the Ilkhanate, the Golden Horde often goes to war with its neighbor to the south, the Mongol-ruled Ilkhanate, again in the Middle East, today's Iran, Iraq, the Caucasus. But even during periods of warfare, we see in the sources there's still merchants making the journeys through the Caucasus Mountains. And also hugely important to the Mongol economy, the Golden Horde economy, is the Black Sea, especially the Crimean Peninsula, which the Mongols control. Obviously, there were some Italian communities there, Genoese, Venetians, not only in Crimea, but also in a number of other settlements across the Black Sea coastline, but even in the Golden Horde capitals, who were part of these networks going all the way across the Mediterranean. There was large trade with prisoners or captured peoples in the Golden Horde. They're also sold as slaves to the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, who become the famous Mamluk warriors there. It's sort of this, the Mongols are taking actions to actively promote trade and along the Silk Road economically, literally easing trade at some point by, I don't know if there's evidence for building bridges, but they're definitely supporting the actual literal routes through the steppe, through the region. They have these cities that are proving desirable for people to travel to. The strength, when the Golden Horde is strong and can enforce peace on the steppes, this is also hugely beneficial to actually getting people to make the journey, to find it safe enough to make the journey. I mean, it's a lot of elements. Like there's much more too we can get into. Obviously, I'd have to look at some of my notes a bit too. But there's like the archaeology of these cities has revealed objects, coins, treasures from around the world. And here, communities of incredibly diverse origin. You have burials of people, not necessarily the skeletons always surviving, but you can tell from the style of burial. This is, a Christian burial. This is a Muslim burial, but these are also burials of people who would have been originating in China, for example, Mongol burials, Turkic burials. I mentioned some of the details of the city a bit earlier. So the Golden Horde Khans, for them, this Silk Route, this Pax Mongolica, this ease of trade literally across Mongol Asia was massively important to them. And we see a lot of their decisions, like they have trade disputes with the Italians, for example, or the Mongols would try and increase like the tariffs on their goods. We see even trade blockades happening when there's disputes with the Italians in Crimea, where the Khans try and get more control over this. And as a result, so the Italians they put a blockade on the shoreline, and then the Mongols, the Golden Horde, forbids the export of grains from what's today Ukraine, its territory across the region. And this actually has effects across like all of the Eastern Mediterranean, because this grain was being sent to people in the Byzantine Empire all along the coast through into Greece and again parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. Like all these systems are connected here, and so I could go on and on and on
Please
about
do.
it. It's there's the Italian. It's kind of been a little, I don't want to say ignored, but not analyzed as deeply as it could have been. But in recent years, there's been some fascinating research into materials from Italian, Venetian archives that are discussing some of these trade connections here.
Right.
And how you have the Italian Senate, the Venetian Senate debating over how to react to political events happening in the Golden Horde because they're concerned over how it's going to affect their trade contacts there. And then, of course, too. So this is we've been talking about the Black Sea, but then we also have the Baltic, and this Hansa League interactions there, where we mentioned the Rus princes collecting that tribute there. So we'd have things where when the Hansa League in some years would cut off the silver export to Novgorod and those couple cities on what's the Gulf that kind of Finland is?
Not are you talking about the one by Finland?
Yeah, got like
check it out actually.
It's like St. Peter's.
I don't have a James, so I don't have anyone to look it up for me, so I have to look it up myself. Are you talking about the one north of Murmansk or the one by Finland and Sweden?
North of Murmansk, where like St. Petersburg and stuff is on
the Barents Sea is what it's called.
No,
could that be it?
Bering Sea, that's the one on the eastern, like between
that's
Alaska.
North of Murmansk, which is the one like the Kola Island.
Yeah,
that's what comes up. That's what the nearest one. Or you do have the Kara Sea. That's
Kara Sea. That's too.
That's what comes.
No, that's too north. Anyway, so the point is you have this.
Yeah.
And these ports here, sort of around the area where Finland. I'm going to remember it as soon as we're done talking to you. It's going to come to me, and I'll be so embarrassed about it.
Right.
But this is a really important. So for the northern trade. So. For the silver coming in, and we'd have cases where even the Hansa League would cut off the silver exports to where Novgorod is.
Right.
And this having effect on the interactions between where now the Mongols are getting mad at the Rus princes or the Grand Prince who isn't able to bring in this tribute because he's being affected by the economic conditions over there, but also the Golden Horde was a huge exporter of, I mentioned grains, but furs, honey, wax, salt, slaves. Like it's easy to sort of dismiss, that nomads, Mongols as, they're just like these barbarians, these savages. But when you actually get into the sources, you see this surprisingly, not even really that surprising, but this great interest in economic matters, in making money and taking advantage of the natural or human resources.
I'm going to go on a limb here and say that I don't know if this sounds racist in a way, but I hope it doesn't. But you think that because they're nomads, what do they need money for, right? What value is money for? But it's clearly an importance for the nomads as well.
It's not even just
not wrong, but
Well, it's not even just money. It's also goods from elsewhere. Spices, glass, fine textiles, silk. It's not called the Silk Roads, ironically, right? We see lots of imported weapons and armors from Mamluk Egypt show up in graves in the Golden Horde. We see wine, there's hundreds of like amphora found in what's now the Golden Horde.
I don't have an ignorance right there, but I get what you mean.
It's and money is a huge part. There's the Golden Horde has a rich there's a rich study of Golden Horde numismatics, and it's found we don't really know that much about it because basically every couple of years it gets completely overturned where someone makes a new argument. We go, wow, but there's huge coin hoards we find associated with the Golden Horde, and there's coins from India, China, across Europe that are found in these Golden Horde hordes. And we have to wonder, and as we're going to get to shortly, all of these cities were horribly sacked and looted at the close of the 14th century and in the 15th century too. So everything we find archaeologically or mentioned in the sources is only a small fraction of the wealth of these cities.
Let me nice in there. So that's what come to, you mentioned him before, Tamerlane or Timur Lenk. if you run, I believe that was his original name. How did it run? What did he have a personal vendetta against the Mongols, or did he just want to be conqueror? Well,
So
did he,
first,
how did he get to power? So and become so the
so
this
Timur
conqueror.
was born in what's now Uzbekistan
Mm.
in the 1330s. There's a popular, I think 1335 is normally called his year of birth, but it coincides with the year of the death of the last really powerful Ilhan. So it's probably a retroactive thing rather than his actual year of birth. But so he's born in the 1330s, and sort of this minor Turkic Mongolic aristocracy. So he alleges to have been able to trace his ancestors to a shared ancestor with Genghis Khan. The family line he belongs to, it appears in Mongolia in the early 13th century. But he's in sort of the upper aristocracy of a kind of minor group of nomads who are around Samarkand.
Right.
And he's basically a nobody up until the Khan, I won't get too deep here, but the Khan of the Eastern Chadhai Khanate comes and has an invasion, knocks out the local powers, and the leader of Timur's, well, let's call it here a tribe. It's not really a tribe, but the leader here, he flees before this Khan, and this Khan then appoints Timur as the man in charge of, and this sort of becomes the start to Timur's rise to power.
We should mention as well, there's one reason why he strolled in fame to Tamerlane, because of one of his arms was disabled, which is
an arm and a leg. So
you don't think he'd be the ultimate warrior to bring down the Mongols.
We get different versions of what happened here, and there's some versions are more negative than others, because some are it's a bit more heroic. Some of them it's like he was stealing a sheep, and the owner of the sheep shot him with an arrow, and it's that he lost his. We see it in the sources, and also when they exhumed his body in the 1940s, that he had a significant wound to, I think it was his right leg. Like he walked with a pronounced limp, and probably couldn't have walked very far on his own. And he was also missing at least 2 fingers on his right hand, the 2 smaller fingers. And he might have had other wounds to it as well.
Like I said, you don't think that is warrior material.
He basically, over the 1360s, he kind of goes through this period of like vagabondage where he's kind of reduced to just like a few followers, and he's kind of in this period of constant fighting. The wound occurs at some point there. And then he starts being called by people who don't like him as Timur Ilang in Persian, or Aksak Timur in Turkish, which is that means Timur the Lame, and hence in English Tamerlane.
Right.
When he's more often, it's often useful to call him as that, because almost every other guy in this period is named some variation of Timur. It means iron in Turkic and Mongolian, and it was hugely popular part of names. And it's sometimes hard to tell who's being spoken about because of it, because they're all named Timur or something. But anyways, so Timur, when he's rising to power, he's picturing it like he's justifying himself as a protector of the Mongol government. Because here's the thing, as the Mongol Empire breaks up, the Chinggisid legitimacy itself doesn't go away. Like for Timur's followers, who are also mainly these horse archers, these nomads, they're still viewing that the rightful ruler of the world has to be a descendant of Genghis Khan. So Timur, who is not a descendant of Genghis Khan, even though he marries into the family and tries to claim common ancestry with him, he can't rule in his own right. So almost for his entire length of the time he actually has power, from 1370 until his death, or until like 1 year before his death, his official title is just like Emir, of just like a guardian, or and the actual ruler is a Chinggisid prince who he just has as a puppet. and he cycles through a number of them, and they're basically nobodies.
He's a regent, more or less, in a sense.
Yeah, he's the guard. Like, there's the best anecdote of this is the famous scholar Ibn Khaldun meets Timur outside of Damascus, 1400, I think, 1400 maybe. 1401. I'm getting the year kind of mixed up here. About like that kind of range. It can be 1400 to 1402. And so Ibn Khaldun has a meeting in Timur in his Urdu, and Ibn Khaldun, he's just fluffing Timur up. He's saying all these, oh, you're so powerful, the ruler of the world. And Timur goes, I'm not the ruler of the world. I'm just a guardian of the Khan, who's right here. And he goes to point to the Khan, and then they find out the Khan isn't even in the tent. Like, he snuck out to go drinking or something. And like, there's this moment, like awkward silence. We're looking around like, where is he? Where is he? Like they're maintaining this facade of it.
Right.
Which is, it's important, because if you remove this is going to be like spiritually unwise. Like, it's going to bring misfortune to get rid of this guy and be ruling in your own right. Like, both like metaphysical sense, but also in a physical sense, there's a lot of princes and things who aren't going to take nicely to the idea of Timur doing away without this modicum of respect for the Chinggisid lineage. So what Timur does, he wants to make basically a collection of puppet Khans. So he has a puppet Khan for the Chagatai Khanate, then he has a puppet Khan for the Ilkhanate, and then he has a puppet Khan, or he tries to have a puppet Khan for the Golden Horde. Now this brings us to Toktamish Khan. So Toktamish is a descendant of Jochi, but from a secondary, one of the minor sons. I don't remember which one right now, because there is some debate over which son it was, actually. And it changes depending on the source. Toktamish, he ends up down on his luck, and he flees to Timur's court. And he gets some backing from Timur, he gets some support, and Timur helps Toktamish take power in this eastern half of the Khanate, this blue horde or white horde in the east. And from there, Toktamish on his own is sort of able to take power. And while Timur is fighting in the south, in Iran and India, Toktamish is steadily traveling west and able to take power in the Golden Horde and declare himself Khan. Now, Toktamish basically at this point goes, I'm the big dog now. Because at that point, there basically isn't another Chinggisid Khan who is actually having real power. The Mongols have been expelled from China, and the Khan has fled to Mongolia, but he doesn't really have... It's very like... Probably Toktamish didn't really know what was happening with him. So Toktamish just kind of assumes he's not to be considered. Toktamish knows the Chagatai Khan is just a puppet for Timur, and in the Ilkhanites, there isn't an Ilkhanite anymore. So Toktamish changes his title. He's not just Toktamish Khan, he's Toktamish Khan. That is Khan of Khans. This is previously the title reserved for the Great Khan, the main Khan of the Mongol Empire, the chief overlord. So this is the title of like that the Khans in China had held. So Toktamish takes this himself, and it seems he starts going like, okay, so for the last 40 years, the Golden Horde had suffered from the Black Death, some ecological crisis, constant civil wars, disruption of its economy. With the breakup of these other Khanates, this really upends as well as the Black Death, this really upends the Silk Road economy the Golden Horde had been reliant upon. So Toktamish, he wants to reverse this. He wants to put things on the right course. He's really proud of his Chinggisid ancestry. He's tightening the leash on dissidents within the Golden Horde, within the Rus principalities. He burns down Moscow in 1382. And it's like he's on track here to like make the Golden Horde great again, kind of thing. And so he looks at Timur, and what he sees in Timur is a rival. He is like infuriated by the disrespect that Timur is showing to the Chinggisid lineage by presuming to rule over lands that should belong to the Chinggisids. Like Toktamish is not falling for the puppet Khan facade that Timur is putting on here. And they're both interested in ruling the same territories in Central Asia and the Caucasus and Iran. With the loss of with the fall of the Ilkhanate, the Golden Horde wants to take control of those lands directly, especially the Caucasus around Tabriz, Azerbaijan today. And just the sheer fact that you had two militarized, very expansionist, ambitious, massively powerful states side by side each other, it's not really a good formula for neighborly relations. Is in all reality, it's probably both of them are thinking it's a matter of time before one of us attacks the other. Toktamish has the first blow, and he starts invading these Caucasian lands, and then Central Asia. He lays siege to Timur's capital of Samarkand, and Timur can't let this bide, and he invades the Golden Horde twice. And both times he's victorious, but both times the battles, they're closely fought. Like, both of these men are very good commanders. These are probably the narrowest victories Timur has. And I mean, he wins. That's all that ends up mattering. But it's Toktamish gives him a run for his money here.
Yeah.
Like, these are massive, massive battles. But after both of these campaigns, Toktamish escapes Timur. Timur can't catch him, but Timur beats his army in the field. So after the first campaign, Timur had withdrawn, and he tried to appoint a puppet ruler there, but Toktamish is able to sort of come back, throw the guy out, get his power again, and attack Timur again. So the second time around, Timur can't let this slide, because he knows, okay, if I leave here without doing anything about this same thing's going to happen again in another 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So this in 1395, after Timur's victory on the Terek River, Timur then goes on a methodical campaign, basically annihilating every single major urban center of the Golden Horde, with the capitals of Sarai, Ukek, Haji Tarhan, into Crimea. Either Timur is leading the campaigns himself or sending his guys out, and it's just like utter destruction of these sites and settlements. They find some of these cities, when they excavate them, they find the bodies weren't even buried afterwards. Like, they find the skeletons were just left to lie and were covered. They find even piles of skulls in some of these ones, signs of where buildings were burnt down and never rebuilt. Like, it was like Timur was thorough.
Yeah.
And he comes in and he's giving a death blow to a Golden Horde. It actually seemed to be getting back on its feet after some hard 40 years. And then he calls off the campaign in 1396. There's been resistance against him. Timur never likes leaving his lands unoccupied for too long. He's worried about getting overextended, so then he falls back to his empire. He appoints some puppet khans to try and set up, make this a more pliant area, but they get overthrown, and Toktamish then spends the next 10 years basically in constant fighting, trying to get the throne back. And then Toktamish's sons do this for another 10 years. And there's a couple guys, you have a figure named Edegu, who is not a Chinggisid, but he appoints a bunch of puppet khans, and he's in conflict with Toktamish's sons. Toktamish, he's getting support from the Lithuanians and invading the Golden Horde. One of Toktamish's sons actually fights alongside the Lithuanians at the Battle of Tannenberg or Grunwald in 1410, I think it is, against the Lithuanians and Poles versus the Teutonic Knights. Toktamish's son fights alongside the Lithuanians, and then the Lithuanians give him some support for trying to reclaim the throne of the Golden Horde like the next year. And he actually does it, and he lasts, I think, 2 years before he gets deposed and killed. But this is what happens following Timur's invasion: is you get a couple guys who are able to hold on to power for 5, maybe 10 years, and then they're overthrown, and it falls into years of civil war and conflict.
Disarray.
And essentially what happens, like, things stabilize like in 1430s into like 3 or 4 power centers. And then the next decade will be spent in constant fighting. And essentially, like, it's not like one moment of breakup. It's kind of like this steady course of these power centers developing and kind of like shaking themselves apart steadily over years and years and years until they're just becoming their own Khanates. By the middle of the 15th century, so around 1450, you're starting to see them really just being their own Khan. Like, each one still thinks he's the Khan of the Golden Horde. But the problem is you have like 4 or 5 guys at a time considering themselves the Khan of the Golden Horde.
This is like after the Roman Empire fell. Everyone wanted to be the Roman Empire, and everyone saw themselves as the successor of the Roman Empire. You had 5 or 6 of them.
Yeah,
so it was kind
exactly.
of like that.
And this does huge damage to just the prestige of the position, but also the actual power of each of these Khans as they're being wasted in civil wars. It completely obliterates these trade networks that had been so carefully built up in the 13th and early 14th centuries. And this is good for example, for the Rus princes, who are in this period gradually being subsumed under the power of the Prince of Moscow.
Because you had to remember that Moscow was irrelevant, and basically up until now it was just a small city-state up until this time of age.
Yeah, this is without the Prince of Moscow only rises to power because he gets in good with the Khan of the Golden Horde, Uzbek, in the early 14th century. This is the only reason they end up being anything other than just this little village in the wilderness. But I mean, this is also the period you see the conversion, like the total conversion of the Turkic and nomadic element of the Golden Horde to Islam, for example. This process is essentially completed by 1500, let's say. Like, it'd been a steady process since the conversion of Berkhan in the 1250s, but it's slow going. And then also, by this point, you've also long lost Mongolian as even the language of the royal family. It's been replaced by Turkic languages, and hence they're Tartars rather than Mongols. We should be calling them by that point. And
of course, is this when we consider the end of the Golden Horde and the Mongol Empire after Timur's invasion?
The end, we can usually 1502 is considered the end. This is because what happens is the Khan of Crimea defeats kind of the other major claimants to being Khan of the Golden Horde in battle. But now, in sort of the older historiography, you'd see it as like, this is the end. The Golden Horde ceases to exist at this moment. But what we actually see from the contemporary sources and letters from the period after this year, the Khan of Crimea, he sees himself as having become the Khan of the Golden Horde. And he starts referring to himself as Great Khan of the Great Ulus. And he actually extends his power eastwards, retakes some of this old Golden Horde territory, and there's an effort to like restore the Golden Horde. Like, they don't see it as ending in 1502.
And we spoke about this offline as well before we started recording, that while Putin, when he invaded Crimea, he talked about this historical claim that Russia has this historical claim, but the Khanate itself, like we talked about, it did exist basically, although it was a vassal later of the Ottomans. It did exist up until 1700s, late 18th century, until Catherine the Great invaded. So they did exist for a long time.
Yeah, you can fully make the argument that the Golden Horde stops existing when Catherine the Great annexes the Crimean Khanate. It's you could even make the argument that some of the Khanates that emerge in Central Asia, such as the are because they're ruled by lines of Jochi, of his sons and their descendants. You can also say these are also the heirs, successors of the Golden Horde, even though there isn't really great evidence for them actually continuing the title of Khan of the Golden Horde, of the Great Horde over there. But it doesn't, like I said, it's not, the Golden Horde doesn't just stop existing one year.
Right.
It's essentially this, you have this period of formation of like its greatest power, early 14th century, a period of decline in the late 14th century, rises again under Toktamish. You have the invasion of Timur. It's a mortal wound it doesn't recover from, but it doesn't kill it then. It's sort of from there, it's a steady kind of breaking apart, and sort of imagine a really old car that's been beaten to hell and back, and it's driving, that's still got a couple kilometers left on it, and it's shaking, and there's parts flying off of it. But it's not coming to a full stop. No one's slamming on the brakes. It's just kind of going along, and it's been left in neutral, and it's kind of like coasting along.
Right. Slowly dying.
Yeah, exactly. So like depending on how you want to read it, the Golden Horde as part of the Mongol Empire exists for 500 years, 600 years.
That's quite impressive.
It's not a small thing, and for a great part of that history, it's a major world power. Again, when Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century is annexing these other Khanates, it's sort of, he's playing a bit in his diplomacy with the Khans and the Khans of Kazan, of the Khans of Sibir, of Siberia, of Astrakhan. There's an effort kind of playing in the diplomacy of sort of into these tropes of the Golden Horde of where the Russian Tsar, he's the white Tsar, the white Khan, but even the title of Tsar. So this comes from obviously Caesar. Originally from Caesar, yes. And in the medieval Rus chronicles, it's not used for the Rus princes, it's used for the Khan of the Golden Horde. Tsar is a translation of Khan, of emperor. So when the Prince of Moscow is becoming Tsar, he's not just kind of the successor to Rome, it's because it's kind of like the successor to the Golden Horde in a way. Now, I don't want to overstate that, because some people like to go like, oh, Russia's the successor to the Golden Horde, and this is why they're doing what they're doing in Ukraine right now. No, because most, like Russia, like I said, Russia plays a little bit diplomatically with this aspect, or Muscovy plays a little bit with this diplomatically, but most of the Russian imperialism, the way it develops, is mostly this European imitation. It's not this Khan aspect is only kind of existing in diplomacy and negotiations with other nomadic powers, and kind of like almost from the sense of like, we can make them understand our new empire better if they just think of us as a continuator rather than a wholly new thing. And it's kind of the like even under Ivan the Terrible there, part of the reason he does this expansion is because it's like this crusading fervor takes over in his court, and he's convinced to do some of these things. But they don't. I mean, it's a complicated, and I'm not a historian of this later period, so I don't want to step on my own foot here. I'm sure I probably have in some aspect said something that's been shot dead in the scholarship for years there, but there is I suppose in almost typical Russian fashion, that kind of not quite Eastern, not quite Western, it's often accused of. Now, as someone who studies the Mongol Empire specifically, I don't really see a continuation and really a practical level of this Mongol to Russian Imperial. Like they're very different in forms here. Like from the Russian, like you see different periods, but a general trend towards trying to like Christianize the local peoples and break up their local networks and things, and really get into the everyday lives of the people in a way that you don't see under the Mongols. Like that's a much more European form of imperialism and colonialism than the Chinggisid one was, because the Chinggisid nomadic one is it's almost more this extraction, if that makes sense, like this idea of like, as long as you pay your taxes and whatever, we don't care what you do in your everyday life. We don't care who you worship, as long as it's worshiping or you're praying for the health of the Khan.
Now, they obviously have, the Golden Horde obviously have a huge impact on Mongol history and Asian history in itself. But what would you say is the legacy of the Golden Horde?
I mean, there's a huge influence on the sort of migration and movements of the Turkic peoples across the region. And so a lot of them, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Tatars, are tracing their origins either symbolically or from a just purely genetic sense through the Golden Horde. It was hugely important as kind of this highway for the Silk Roads and this Pax Mongolica kind of period. It's one of the consequences of it, of course, is this accidental unification of the Rus principalities and domination of Moscow over them.
They have a huge influence on medieval Russian history, that's for sure.
The borders of Russia today, why it's such a huge state, is this pushing east into the Golden Horde lands, and kind of this first at a practical level of like, okay, because nomadic peoples of the successors of the Horde continue to raid and attack Rus principalities, or in early Muscovy, the Crimean Khans even burned down Moscow. What's the years? 15, like quite late, 1580, I want to say.
No, that's me.
I might be wrong.
You're the historian here, not me.
I don't know. I'm getting onto shaky ground here, but they don't stop being a military threat, and this affects a lot of the actions of the Muscovy and the early Russian Empire. Is in reaction to still the continued potential threat of these nomadic states, or of the Golden Horde successors, the Crimean Khanate and its connection to the Ottoman Empire is a huge effect also on the Russian Empire as it's trying to expand southwards. It becomes like this playing stone there.
They did bring an end, and as I mentioned this before as well, they did bring an end to the Abbasid Caliphate in late, I think it was 13th century, I think. Yeah,
well, that's if we want to go to the Mongol Empire. As it wasn't there were Golden Horde troops who partook in the Saqa Baghdad, but I think Hulagu of the Ilkhanate can take more credit for that. I'm thinking of the Golden Horde in particular on its own. Yes, and then it continued to affect Poland, Hungary. They sort of the consolidation of these states in the 14th century. We can attribute some of this to the threat the Mongols pose. I mean, you could go into. I don't tend to like why is this state important for world history? Because every state is important for world history. Everyone has its role to to play. And if you remove even a single one, you get a very different modern world.
Yeah.
Today. So I'm just trying to like point out some of the bigger, more obvious aspects here. So I mean,
how is Mongol history in general taught? Do you not have an idea how it's taught in Mongolia itself? How is
generally in Mongolia today? The way it works, like the school systems and stuff, there is the focus is on the early Mongol Empire, specifically the life of Genghis Khan. The conquests outside of Mongolia aren't really that emphasized. Like it's not really a good look to go like the whole conquest aspect. Like when it is brought up, it's mentioned in context of things about religious freedom and freedom of trade and freedom of connectivity. These are kind of the elements that get associated with the Mongol Empire, not the military aspect in terms of the modern Mongolian image of it. Like even the Golden Horde, the Golden Horde itself, in terms of the specific state, is a very minor part of this in terms of the modern Mongolian conception of the, not that it's not, but it's kind of like almost incidental and quite secondary to, because in Mongolia, the important legacy of Genghis Khan is the unifier of the Mongolic peoples and creation of a specifically Mongolian identity, promotion of the Mongolian language within the Mongolian plateau. And it's like,
and you said this earlier on, that there was no nationalism, and we stated this before in the podcast, that nationalism wasn't, we made even an episode on the history of nationalism last year, but is it kind of nationalistic pride in a sense?
It's become like Genghis Khan is, I would say, for an American audience, let's say, like the kind of way you'd hear an American talk about George Washington. This kind of idea, the great unifier. And this is why Genghis in particular has this association, like this kind of sage-like, like a protective father-like figure of the nation. And that's where most of them today Mongolian focus on the Mongol Empire is. So I mean, the military, there are people who like the military side, of course, and like the, dream of the days when the Mongols were bossing around China and Russia, of course, but that's a minority part of people are quite loud about that on the internet, because those sorts of people always are quite loud on those things. But no, the legacy of the Mongol Empire in Mongolia is the creation of Mongolia, really.
Do you think there would be a Mongolia as we know it today without Genghis Khan?
Oh, not at all. I mean, without Genghis Khan, you have the entire planet looks dramatically different. So I don't want to even fathom a guess as to what's would or would not to
It's a rabbit hole for sure.
It's that's years of your life to fully investigate what that might have been. So both on a massive scale and a large scale in terms of historical detail there.
Yeah, I think we're gonna round it up there. I think if you listen this long, I think we spoke for almost 2 hours now, and I could easily, like I always say, I could easily talk about another hour of history if I had the time. But before I go, of course, you mentioned the YouTube channel, which I will put in the description. Do you have anything else you want to promote? You have social media on Twitter, of course. Do you have anything else you want me to plug down in the description?
On Instagram and Facebook and those things, and the Jackmeister Mongol History. If you look that up, that's the name you'll find me under. So, and you'll find I post a bunch of stuff on my research, but also on aspects of Mongol history that I talk about. The scholarship, the primary sources, all those sorts of things. Kind of, I jump around on different parts of the empire. I'm not really focused on. I do a lot of research on the Golden Horde, my PhD, but in general, I write about many different aspects of it.
So what do you cover on your YouTube channel? Let's talk about that before.
On my YouTube channel, mostly the videos I post now are kind of like this myth busting kind of thing. Is kind of like my most recent video, I dealt with the idea of Chinggis Khan having green eyes and red hair. This kind of popular one, and I traced it through the primary sources and went, okay, this isn't actually in the primary sources, but here's where this image may have come from. And I do a lot of this. When I post video, because I don't post videos that often, but I like this going into like this common misconceptions. Like I'm doing one right now, or it's going to be a short series about blacksmithing and metal production in the steppe. And because the common image is this didn't happen in the steppe, but I'm going to showcase the archaeological research and the textual support for the ways this was done, both in the Mongol Empire and earlier nomadic peoples.
I definitely subscribe myself, and I hope you will do the same. This has been With That Aged Well. We are also available on social media, on Twitter under With That Aged Well, Instagram With That Aged Well. You can find us on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts these days. And if you are on iTunes, please consider writing a little review if you like this episode. That would help us out a lot. Please check out some other episodes, and you're definitely going to find something that you like. My name is Erlend, and I'll see you next time.